1 year after the courthouse incident, Admiral Jake Morrison stood in front of the United Nations General Assembly, wearing his dress uniform for the first time since the war ended. The blue fabric was crisp and clean, and his medals gleamed under the bright lights. He looked healthy and strong again after months of medical treatment and therapy. The man who had once been homeless and forgotten was now ready to address the entire world. The UN building was packed with delegates from every nation on Earth, as well as representatives from dozens of alien species. This was the most important speech Jake had ever given because it would announce a new chapter in how humanity treated its veterans and heroes. He had spent weeks writing and practicing what he wanted to say. Secretary General Maria Santos introduced Jake as the greatest military hero in human history and the founder of a new movement to support veterans around the world. The audience stood and applauded for 5 full minutes before Jake could begin speaking. He waited patiently at the podium and thought about how much his life had changed since that terrible night when he was arrested for trespassing. Jake began his speech by thanking everyone who had helped him during his darkest period. He mentioned Judge Patricia Hill, who had shown him justice and compassion, Dr. Susan Palmer, who had helped him heal his mind and spirit, Colonel Amy Foster, who had never given up on him, the alien ambassadors who had shown him that his sacrifice was remembered across the galaxy. But Jake said the most important thanks went to all the ordinary people who had reached out to help him after hearing his story. Veterans who shared their own struggles and recovery stories. Families who sent letters and care packages. Citizens who donated money to help other homeless veterans. Their kindness had reminded him that humanity was worth fighting for and saving. Jake announced the creation of the Morrison Institute for Veteran Affairs, which would be the largest and most comprehensive program ever established to help veterans transition back to civilian life. The institute would have facilities in every major city and would provide medical care, mental health services, job training, housing assistance, and social support for any veteran who needed help. The institute would be funded by contributions from governments around the world, as well as donations from alien allies who wanted to honor Jake's service. Queen Zara had personally contributed enough money to build the first 10 facilities. Ambassador Clix 7 had arranged for Zephyrian medical technology to be shared with human doctors to improve treatment for trauma and depression. Jake explained that the institute would use a revolutionary new approach to veteran care based on the idea that healing required more than just medical treatment. Veterans needed purpose and community and connection to other people who understood their experiences. The institute would help veterans find new careers and build new families and create new meaning in their lives. The centerpiece of each institute facility would be a memorial garden where veterans could honor fallen comrades and reflect on their service. Jake said that remembering the dead was important, but living veterans also needed to focus on building positive futures. The gardens would be places of both mourning and hope, where veterans could process their experiences in a peaceful setting. Jake's voice became emotional as he talked about the crew members who had died in the Battle of Kepler 442. He said that their sacrifice would be meaningless if society continued to abandon the veterans who survived. Every homeless veteran was a failure to honor the memory of those who gave their lives for freedom. The Morrison Institute would make sure that no veteran ever fell through the cracks again. The Admiral announced that he would serve as the director of the Institute for the next 5 years. He would use his experience as both a military leader and a veteran struggling with trauma to guide the development of new programs and services. He wanted to make sure that the Institute really understood what veterans needed instead of just providing what bureaucrats thought they needed. Jake also revealed that Amy Foster would serve as his deputy director and help run the day-to-day operations. Many other veterans from his old command had volunteered to work at the Institute and help their fellow veterans. Bob Miller would head the job training program. Sarah Williams would coordinate family support services. Even some of the alien ambassadors had offered to serve as advisors. The speech was broadcast live to every human colony and allied world across the galaxy. Millions of beings watched as the hero of the galactic war committed his life to helping others who had served and sacrificed for their people. It was a powerful message that true leadership meant taking care of those who had served under you, even after the fighting was over. After the UN speech, Jake traveled around the world to visit veterans and promote the new institute. He spoke at military bases and hospitals and veteran organizations. Everywhere he went, he met people who had been inspired by his story to seek help for their own problems or to volunteer to help other veterans. His example showed that it was possible to recover from even the worst trauma. The first Morrison Institute facility opened 6 months later in Washington, D.C. The building was beautiful and modern with gardens and art and comfortable spaces where veterans could relax and heal. The staff included doctors and therapists and social workers, but also peer counselors who were veterans themselves and could relate to what their clients were experiencing. Jake spent most of his time at the Washington facility meeting with veterans and helping design new programs. He particularly enjoyed working with young veterans who were just starting to deal with the aftermath of their service. He could help them avoid some of the mistakes he had made and get the help they needed before their problems became overwhelming. One of Jake's favorite programs was the mentor system, where experienced veterans were paired with newer ones who needed guidance and support. The mentors helped their partners navigate the complex systems of benefits and services, while also providing friendship and understanding. Jake often served as a mentor himself and found great satisfaction in helping others rebuild their lives. The Institute also pioneered new treatments for post-traumatic stress disorder and other combat-related mental health conditions. Dr. Palmer led a research team that developed innovative therapies combining traditional counseling with virtual reality, technology, and meditation techniques borrowed from alien cultures. The treatment success rates were much higher than anything that had been achieved before. Within 2 years, Morrison Institute facilities were operating in 50 cities around the world. The program had helped thousands of veterans find housing, jobs, medical care, and most importantly, hope for the future. The suicide rate among veterans dropped dramatically in areas where the Institute was operating. Homelessness among veterans decreased by over 60%. Jake's personal life also improved during this period. He started dating Dr. Palmer and they developed a close relationship based on their shared commitment to helping veterans. She understood his struggles better than anyone and helped him continue his own healing process. They eventually moved in together and talked about getting married. 5 years after founding the Institute, Jake stepped down as director to focus on writing and speaking. He had written a book about his experiences called From Hero to Homeless, to Hope, that became a bestseller and inspired millions of people around the world. The book was translated into dozens of languages, including several alien languages. Jake continued to work as a senior advisor to the Institute and remained active in veteran advocacy. He testified before Congress about the need for better veteran services and spoke at military academies about the importance of taking care of soldiers after the fighting was over. His voice had become one of the most respected in discussions about veteran affairs. The Morrison Institute had grown into a global network with facilities on every inhabited world where humans lived. Alien species had started their own versions of the Institute to help their own veterans. The concept of comprehensive veteran care that Jake had pioneered was spreading across the galaxy and helping millions of beings who had served in military conflicts. On the 10th anniversary of the courthouse incident, Jake returned to the small courtroom where his new life had begun. Judge Hill was still serving and welcomed him back warmly. The courthouse had been renamed the Morrison Justice Center and featured a museum about the Galactic War and the importance of caring for veterans. Jake stood in the same spot where he had once faced criminal charges as a homeless man and reflected on everything that had changed. He thought about the crew members who had died in the Battle of Kepler 442 and felt proud that their sacrifice had led to something positive and lasting. The Morrison Institute would continue their legacy by protecting and caring for the veterans who survived to fight another day. As Jake left the courthouse that day, he felt truly at peace for the first time since the war ended. He had found a way to honor the dead while helping the living. His greatest victory was not the space battle that saved humanity, but the personal battle that saved himself and thousands of other veterans. The homeless man who had been forgotten by society had become a beacon of hope for everyone who had ever served their people in uniform. Judge Patricia Hill called the courthouse to order the next morning for what would be the final hearing in the case of Admiral Jake Morrison. The courtroom was packed again with hundreds of people, including government officials, military officers, alien ambassadors, and ordinary citizens who wanted to witness this historic moment. Television cameras from around the world were broadcasting live. The judge began by formally dismissing all charges against Admiral Morrison. She said that after learning about his service and sacrifice for humanity, it would be inappropriate and unjust to prosecute him for seeking shelter. She also announced that the courthouse would be conducting a full review of how homeless veterans were treated in the legal system. But Judge Hill was not finished. She stood up from her bench and did something that had never happened before in her courtroom. She walked down to where Jake was sitting and offered a formal apology on behalf of the entire justice system. She said that society had failed him and that he deserved much better treatment after everything he had done for his country and his species. The judge's apology was broadcast around the world and became a powerful symbol of how institutions needed to change their treatment of veterans. Legal experts said it was unprecedented for a sitting judge to leave the bench and personally apologize to a defendant. Judge Hill later said she had to follow her conscience, even if it broke with tradition. After the court hearing, Jake was taken to meet with a team of specialists who had been assembled to help him rebuild his life. Dr. Susan Palmer led the medical team that would treat his post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. She explained that his condition was very treatable. With modern therapy and medication, many veterans had recovered from similar problems and gone on to live full productive lives. The Department of Veterans Affairs had prepared a complete benefits package for Jake, including full medical coverage, a substantial pension, and housing assistance. Director Paul Rodriguez personally delivered the paperwork and apologized for the bureaucratic failures that had allowed such an important veteran to fall through the cracks. He promised that new procedures would prevent this from ever happening again. Jake was offered several different housing options, including a luxury apartment in the city, a house in the suburbs, or even a cabin in the mountains where he could have privacy and peace. He chose a modest apartment near the VA Medical Center where he could easily get treatment and counseling. He did not want anything too fancy because he was still adjusting to the idea of having a normal life again. The most important part of Jake's recovery was reconnecting with other people. Colonel Amy Foster visited him every day and helped him remember what it felt like to have friends and purpose. Other veterans from his old command came to see him and shared stories about their lives after the war. Many of them had struggled with similar problems but had found ways to cope and move forward. Captain Bob Miller brought his 10-year-old son, Jake Miller, who had been named after the admiral. The boy was shy at first but soon started asking questions about space battles and alien technology. Talking to young Jake reminded the admiral why the war had been worth fighting. These children would grow up free because of the sacrifices made by their parents and grandparents. Sarah Williams finally reached the courthouse and was able to meet Admiral Morrison in person. She brought a photograph of her husband and told Jake about the wonderful man who had volunteered for the suicide mission. Jake remembered her husband as a brave officer who had always volunteered for dangerous assignments. Sarah said that meeting, Jake helped her understand that her husband's death had meaning. The conversation with Sarah was difficult for Jake because it brought back memories of all the people who had died under his command. But Dr. Palmer helped him understand that survivor's guilt was a normal reaction and that he was not responsible for their deaths. The crew members had chosen to volunteer because they believed in the mission and wanted to save their families. President Helen Carter arrived at the hospital to personally meet with Admiral Morrison. She brought with her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which was the highest civilian honor the country could give. She said that Jake deserved recognition not just for his military service, but for his sacrifice and continued struggle with the aftermath of war. The president also announced the creation of the Admiral Morrison Foundation for Veteran Mental Health. The foundation would be funded by the government and private donations to provide comprehensive mental health services for all veterans. She said that no veteran should ever have to face their demons alone, the way Jake had been forced to do. Lieutenant General Frank Davis offered Jake several positions within the military, including a return to active duty with a promotion to full general. The military wanted his expertise in planning for future threats and training the next generation of officers. But Jake was not ready to return to that kind of responsibility. He needed time to heal and figure out what he really wanted to do with his life. Instead, Jake accepted a position as a senior advisor to the Veterans Administration. His job would be to help design better programs for veterans who were struggling with post-traumatic stress and other war-related problems. He would also speak at military academies and help train young officers about the real costs of command and the importance of taking care of their people. The alien ambassadors who had visited Jake made good on their offers of friendship and support. Queen Zara established a scholarship fund for human students to study at galactic universities. Ambassador Click 7 arranged for Zephyrian medical experts to share their advanced treatments for trauma and mental illness. The galactic community wanted to help heal the hero who had brought peace to their region of space. Jake's story inspired changes in how society treated homeless veterans. Cities across the country established new programs to identify and help veterans who were living on the streets. The Morrison Act was passed by Congress to provide additional funding for veteran mental health services and to require better coordination between different government agencies. Dr. Palmer worked with Jake for several months to help him process his trauma and guilt. She used a combination of traditional therapy and new treatments that had been developed specifically for combat veterans. Slowly, Jake began to understand that his feelings were normal reactions to abnormal experiences. He learned coping strategies that helped him deal with flashbacks and anxiety attacks. The healing process was not easy, and Jake had many difficult days when he wanted to give up. But having a support system of friends, doctors, and fellow veterans made all the difference. He no longer had to face his problems alone. People who cared about him were there to help when things got hard. 6 months after the courthouse incident, Jake was living independently in his apartment and working part-time at the VA hospital. He still had bad days, but he also had good days when he felt like his old self again. He had learned to ask for help when he needed it, and to accept that recovery was an ongoing process rather than a destination. The most important change in Jake's life was that he had found new purpose. Instead of dwelling on the deaths of his crew members, he focused on helping other veterans who were facing similar struggles. He used his story to show them that it was possible to recover from even the worst trauma and build a meaningful life again. Jake often visited the military memorial where he had been arrested that night so many months ago. But now, instead of sleeping there as a homeless man, he came as a volunteer to help other veterans who gathered there. He made sure they knew about the services available to them and helped connect them with the resources they needed. The memorial had been expanded to include a special section honoring the crew members who died in the Battle of Kepler 442. Jake attended the dedication ceremony and spoke about the brave men and women who had sacrificed their lives for freedom. For the first time since the war ended, he was able to talk about them without feeling overwhelming guilt and sadness. The news about Admiral Jake Morrison reached beyond Earth when alien diplomats stationed in the human capital city heard about the courthouse incident. Ambassador Clix 7 of the Zephyrian Empire was the first to respond. Even though his people had been enemies during the war, he had great respect for human military tactics and especially for the admiral, who had defeated them. Clix 7 was a tall alien with blue skin and 4 arms who served as the chief Zephyrian representative to Earth. His job was to maintain peace between the former enemies and help both species learn from each other. When he heard that Admiral Morrison was homeless and forgotten, he was shocked. In Zephyrian culture, war heroes were honored for life and given the best of everything. The Zephyrian ambassador immediately called his government on their home planet to report what had happened. The Zephyrian emperor himself issued a statement, saying that Admiral Morrison was respected throughout their empire as the greatest human military mind they had ever encountered. Zephyrian military academies studied his tactics and considered him a master strategist. Within hours of the news breaking, Clix 7 arrived at the courthouse in his official diplomatic vehicle. He wore his formal robes and was accompanied by 2 guards and a translator. The crowd outside the courthouse was surprised to see a Zephyrian diplomat, but they allowed him to pass. Many people had never seen an alien up close before. Inside the courthouse, Clix 7 asked to speak with Admiral Morrison privately. Judge Patricia Hill was not sure about allowing an alien diplomat to meet with a defendant, but the situation was so unusual that normal rules did not seem to apply. She agreed to let them meet in a secure conference room with security present. Jake was surprised when he was told that the Zephyrian ambassador wanted to meet him. During the war, he had studied Zephyrian culture and language, but had never spoken to one of them in person. All his contact with the enemy had been through space battles and intercepted communications. He was curious to meet the being whose people he had fought against. Click 7 entered the conference room and immediately performed a traditional Zephyrian gesture of respect by touching all 4 hands to his chest and bowing his head. Through his translator, he told Jake that it was an honor to meet the human who had shown such tactical brilliance during their conflict. He said that Jake's victory had taught the Zephyrian military valuable lessons about strategy. The alien ambassador explained that the Battle of Kepler 442 was now taught in every Zephyrian military school as an example of perfect tactical planning. Jake's decision to sacrifice his flagship had been completely unexpected and had caught the Zephyrian fleet totally unprepared. The move was now called Morrison's Gambit in their military textbooks. Click 7 told Jake that many Zephyrian officers actually respected him more than their own generals because he had been willing to sacrifice himself for his people. In Zephyrian culture, that kind of personal courage was the highest virtue a warrior could display. The ambassador said that Jake would be welcome on any Zephyrian world as an honored guest. The meeting between Jake and the Zephyrian ambassador was broadcast live on television and created a sensation around the world. People were amazed to see the former enemies treating each other with respect and honor. It showed that the war was truly over and that both species could learn from their shared history. Other alien ambassadors heard about Click 7's visit and decided to come to the courthouse as well. Ambassador Vex from the Andromedan Council arrived in the afternoon. The Andromedans had been allies of humanity during the war and had provided ships and weapons to help fight the Zephyrians. Vex wanted to honor the human admiral who had led their combined forces to victory. The Andromedan ambassador was a tall, thin being with silver skin and large black eyes. His species was known for their advanced technology and peaceful nature. They had only joined the war because the Zephyrians had threatened to attack their colonies after conquering the humans. Vex brought gifts of advanced medical equipment to help with Jake's treatment. By evening, representatives from 6 different alien species had come to the courthouse to pay their respects to Admiral Morrison. The Rigelian Trade Federation sent their local consul. The crystal beings from Tau Ceti sent a singing delegation that performed a traditional honor song. Even the mysterious energy beings from the Vega system sent a representative. Each alien delegation brought unique gifts and honors for Jake. The Rigelians offered him a position as a strategic advisor to their military. The crystal beings created a beautiful sculpture that told the story of the Battle of Kepler 442 in their ancient art form. The energy beings shared some of their advanced healing technology to help with his medical treatment. Jake was overwhelmed by the attention from so many different species. During the war, he had commanded ships from several alien allies, but had been too busy with military operations to really get to know their cultures. Now he was learning about the different ways each species honored their heroes and warriors. Alien visitors also brought news about how the galaxy had changed since the war ended. The Zephyrian Empire had become more peaceful and democratic after their defeat. New trade agreements had been signed between former enemies. Young beings from different species were studying together at galactic universities and learning to work together. Dr. Susan Palmer observed Jake's meetings with the alien ambassadors and noticed that he seemed more engaged and alert than he had been since arriving at the courthouse. Talking about military strategy and galactic politics reminded him of his former life and gave him a sense of purpose again. She thought this positive stimulation would help with his recovery. The most surprising visitor was Queen Zara of the Centauri Federation. She had traveled across the galaxy specifically to meet Admiral Morrison after hearing about his situation. Queen Zara was considered one of the most powerful leaders in the known galaxy, and her personal visit showed how important Jake was considered to be by the galactic community. Queen Zara was an elegant being with golden skin and elaborate robes that sparkled with jewels from a dozen different worlds. She spoke perfect English and told Jake that his victory had saved not just humanity, but the entire galactic balance of power. If the Zephyrians had conquered Earth, they would have become too powerful for anyone to stop. The Queen offered Jake a position as Supreme Military Advisor to the Galactic Council, with a palace on the capital world and command of the new combined fleet that protected all member species. It was the highest military position in the galaxy and came with enormous respect and luxury. Jake was honored by the offer but said he needed time to think about it. News reporters from across the galaxy covered the parade of alien visitors to the small courthouse. The story was being broadcast on every inhabited world and had become the biggest news event since the end of the war. Billions of beings were watching to see what would happen to the human hero who had changed galactic history. The alien visits had an unexpected effect on the human crowds outside the courthouse. Seeing their former enemies and allies treating Admiral Morrison with such respect made people realize how important he really was. The battle that saved Earth had been noticed and remembered by beings across the entire galaxy. Children from nearby schools were brought to see the alien ambassadors and learn about galactic history. Many of them had never learned about the Galactics War in school because it happened when they were very young. Meeting real aliens and hearing about Admiral Morrison's heroism made the war seem real and important to them. By the end of the day, Jake had received offers of homes, jobs, and honors. From dozens of different worlds, the galactic community was united in wanting to help the human hero who had sacrificed so much for peace. It was clear that while humans might have forgotten Admiral Morrison, the rest of the galaxy had not. Jake went to sleep that night in his hospital bed thinking about all the strange turns his life had taken. Just 48 hours ago, he had been sleeping on the cold ground next to a memorial. Now alien queens and ambassadors were offering him palaces and positions of power. He was not sure what he wanted to do with the rest of his life, but he knew it would be very different from the lonely months he had spent on the streets. The news about Admiral Jake Morrison spread across the country like wildfire. Television networks interrupted their regular programming to report on the homeless war hero who had been found in a small courthouse. Radio stations played interviews with military experts who explained the importance of the Battle of Kepler 442. Newspapers rushed to print special editions with headlines about the forgotten admiral. Social media exploded with posts about Jake Morrison. The hashtag Admiral Morrison was trending worldwide within 2 hours. People shared articles about the Galactic War and videos of old news reports about the battle that saved Earth. Millions of people who had never heard of Jake Morrison before suddenly learned that he was the reason they were still alive. Sarah Williams was a mother of 3 who lived in Ohio. She had lost her husband in the Galactic War, but never knew exactly how he died or why. When she saw the news about Admiral Morrison, she realized that her husband had been one of the crew members who volunteered for the suicide mission. She started crying as she finally understood that her husband had died saving billions of people. Sarah immediately got in her car and started driving toward the courthouse. She wanted to thank Admiral Morrison in person and tell him that her husband would have been proud to serve under him. She called her sister and asked her to watch the children because this was something she had to do. Her husband's sacrifice finally made sense. President Helen Carter was in a meeting with her cabinet when her chief of staff burst into the room with the news. The president immediately canceled the rest of her schedule and called an emergency press conference. She knew that the country was watching, and she had to respond quickly to show that the government cared about its veterans. At the press conference, President Carter admitted that the system had failed Admiral Morrison. She said it was a national disgrace that the hero who saved Earth was living on the streets. She announced that she was ordering a complete review of veteran services and promised that no war hero would ever be forgotten again. She also said she wanted to meet with Admiral Morrison personally to apologize. The Veterans Administration building in Washington was in chaos as officials tried to figure out how Admiral Morrison had fallen through the cracks. Director Paul Rodriguez called an emergency meeting with his senior staff to find out what had gone wrong. They discovered that Jake had never applied for benefits after leaving the military and had refused offers of help from several organizations. Paul immediately ordered his staff to prepare a full benefits package for Jake, including housing, medical care, and a pension. He also started an investigation into why the VA had not done more to track down important veterans who might need help. The Admiral Morrison case was going to change how they handled veteran outreach forever. Lieutenant General Frank Davis was the current head of Space Command and Jake's former student at the military academy. When he heard the news, he immediately flew to the courthouse in a military transport plane. He brought with him Jake's medals and honors that had been stored in a vault at the Pentagon. He wanted to personally deliver them and ask Jake to return to active duty. At the courthouse, the crowd outside had grown to over 1,000 people. Veterans from all branches of the military came to show their support. Families who had lost loved ones in the Galactic War came to thank the man who had avenged their deaths. Citizens who had never served in the military came to honor a true American hero. News reporter Jennifer Clark was broadcasting live from outside the courthouse for the National Evening News. She interviewed people in the crowd and heard amazing stories about how the Galactic War had affected their lives. Everyone seemed to know someone who had fought in the war or died in the alien attacks on the colonies. Mary Johnson was 90 years old and had lived through many wars. She told Jennifer that Admiral Morrison was the greatest military leader since World War II. Her grandson had served on one of the ships in Jake's fleet and had written letters home about how much the crew respected their admiral. Mary had driven 4 hours to be at the courthouse. Inside the courthouse, Jake was starting to feel better for the first time in months. Seeing Amy Foster and his other former crew members reminded him of who he used to be. Dr. Susan Palmer had examined him and started him on medication for his depression and anxiety. She told him that his condition was treatable and that he could get better with proper care. The charges against Jake were officially dropped when the prosecutor announced that the state would not pursue the case. District Attorney Mike Brown said it would be inappropriate to prosecute a war hero for trying to find shelter. He also announced that his office would review all cases involving homeless veterans to make sure they received proper treatment. Colonel Amy Foster held a second press conference outside the courthouse to give more details about Jake's military service. She brought photographs and documents that showed his many accomplishments before and during the Galactic War. She wanted people to understand that Jake had been a brilliant officer long before he became famous for the suicide mission. Amy explained that Jake had graduated first in his class from the military academy and had served with distinction for 25 years. He had commanded smaller fleets in several successful battles against alien pirates. His tactics were studied in military schools around the world. The suicide mission was just the most famous of his many contributions to human defense. She also talked about Jake's character and leadership style. She said he always put his crew first and never asked anyone to do something he would not do himself. He was known for visiting wounded soldiers in hospitals and attending funerals for crew members who died under his command. He cared deeply about every person who served with him. The news coverage was not limited to Earth. Human colonies on other planets held vigils and parades to honor Admiral Morrison. The colony on New Terra named their main street after him. The research station on Europa declared a planetary holiday. Children who had been born after the war learned for the first time about the man who saved their worlds. International leaders from around the world issued statements praising Admiral Morrison and condemning the treatment he had received. The Prime Minister of England offered him honorary citizenship. The President of France invited him to visit Paris as a guest of honor. Even former enemies expressed their respect for his military genius. But the most important response came from ordinary people who had lived through the Galactic War. Millions of Americans posted messages online thanking Admiral Morrison for saving their lives. They shared memories of watching the news during the war and feeling hopeless until they heard about the victory at Kepler 442. Many people admitted that they had forgotten about the war and the people who fought in it. Life had returned to normal so quickly after the victory that most citizens stopped thinking about the military. The Admiral Morrison story reminded them that freedom always came with a price and that heroes deserved better than to be forgotten. Jake watched some of the news coverage on a television in the courthouse and was amazed by the response. He had been living in isolation for so long that he had forgotten how many people cared about the war and the veterans who fought in it. For the first time in months, he felt like his life might have meaning again. Late that evening, Jake was taken to a private hospital where he could rest and receive proper medical care. Hundreds of people lined the streets as his car drove by. They held signs thanking him and cheering his name. Some threw flowers at the car, others saluted as he passed. It was like a parade for a returning hero. As Jake settled into his hospital bed, he thought about everything that had happened that day. 12 hours ago, he had been a forgotten homeless man facing jail time. Now he was being called the greatest hero in American history. He was not sure he deserved all the attention, but he was grateful that people finally understood what his crew had sacrificed during the war. Danny Rodriguez could not keep quiet any longer. He pulled out his phone and started typing messages to his friends and family. Admiral Jake Morrison is in our courtroom right now. The hero from the Galactic War is here, and he is homeless. He sent the same message to his brother, who worked at the local newspaper, and to his girlfriend, who had many followers on social media. Kevin Wright did the same thing. He texted his old Marine buddies and told them what was happening. Within minutes, the news was spreading through social media faster than anyone could control it. People shared the story with their friends, who shared it with their friends. The hashtag Admiral Morrison started trending on all the major platforms. Lisa Barnes sat next to Jake and felt terrible about how she had handled his case. She had treated him like just another homeless person, when he was actually the most important veteran in the country. She quickly called her supervisor at the public defender office and told them what was happening. They needed to send better lawyers immediately. Judge Hill declared a 30-minute recess so she could figure out what to do next. This was not a normal situation, and she needed time to think. She asked Jake if he wanted to sit down in the defendant area or if he preferred to wait in a private room. Jake said he would rather stay in the courtroom because he did not like small enclosed spaces. The first person to arrive was Colonel Amy Foster, who had been Jake's second-in-command during the war. She worked at the nearby military base and had seen the social media posts about her former admiral. She drove to the courthouse as fast as she could and ran into the building still wearing her uniform. Amy looked at Jake and started crying immediately. She had not seen him since he left the military 3 years ago. He looked so different from the strong, confident leader she remembered. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he had lost a lot of weight. But his eyes were the same intelligent eyes she remembered from their time serving together. Jake looked up when Amy entered the courtroom, and for the first time that day he smiled slightly. Amy had been like a daughter to him during the war. She was the best officer he had ever worked with, and he was proud that she had continued her military career after he left. Seeing her reminded him of better times when he had a purpose and people who depended on him. Amy sat down next to Jake and took his hand. She told him how worried she had been when he disappeared after leaving the military. She had tried to find him, but he had not answered any calls or messages. She asked him why he had not reached out for help when things got bad. Jake said he was too ashamed and did not want to be a burden on anyone. More people started arriving at the courthouse. Veterans who had served under Jake during the war, family members of soldiers who had died in the Battle of Kepler 442, government officials who had heard the news and wanted to show their support. The small courtroom was filling up quickly, and Judge Hill had to ask the bailiffs to open the larger courtroom down the hall. Captain Bob Miller had served on Jake's flagship during the war. He was one of the few people who had survived when Amy took the ship on its suicide mission. Bob had been transferred to another vessel just before the battle, and always felt guilty that he had not been there with his friends when they died. He drove 2 hours from his home to get to the courthouse. Bob found Jake in the crowded courtroom and immediately stood at attention and saluted. Jake looked uncomfortable with the formal military greeting, but he returned the salute out of habit. Bob told Jake that he had named his son after him, and that his family would always be grateful for what Jake had done during the war. Senator Carol Davis arrived with her staff after hearing about the situation from her military advisors. She was the chairwoman of the Veterans Affairs Committee and was embarrassed that such an important veteran had been allowed to become homeless. She immediately called the Department of Veterans Affairs and demanded to know why Admiral Morrison was not receiving proper care and benefits. The news crews started showing up around noon. Local television stations sent reporters and cameramen to cover the story. National news networks picked up the story from social media and sent their own teams. The courthouse parking lot filled with news vans and satellite trucks. Police had to set up barriers to control the crowds. Dr. Susan Palmer was a psychiatrist who specialized in treating veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. She had heard about Jake's situation on the news and immediately drove to the courthouse. She wanted to offer her services for free because she believed that war heroes deserved the best possible care. She had treated many veterans, but never someone as important as Admiral Morrison. Jake felt overwhelmed by all the attention and people. He was not used to being around so many people after months of living alone on the streets. The noise and crowds made him nervous and brought back memories of the stress he felt during the war. Amy stayed close to him and helped him stay calm while everyone else talked around them. Lisa Barnes was replaced by a team of the best lawyers in the city, who volunteered to represent Jake for free. They immediately filed motions to dismiss all charges and asked for a full investigation into how such an important veteran had been allowed to become homeless. They also demanded that Jake receive immediate medical care and housing assistance. Judge Hill returned to the courtroom and was amazed by how many people had gathered. The larger courtroom was packed with over 200 people, and more were waiting outside. She had never seen anything like this in her 15 years as a judge. She called for order and asked everyone to be quiet so she could continue with the proceedings. But before she could speak, Colonel Amy Foster asked for permission to address the court. She wanted to tell everyone exactly what Jake had done during the war and why he deserved better treatment. Judge Hill agreed, and Amy stood up in front of the crowded courtroom to tell Jake's story. Amy spoke with passion and emotion about the Battle of Kepler 442. She described how hopeless the situation had been and how Jake's brilliant tactics had saved humanity from extinction. She talked about the courage it took to send his own ship on a suicide mission, and how he had blamed himself for every death, even though he was a hero. She told the court about the 300 crew members who had volunteered for the mission, including herself. They had all known they were going to die, but they did it anyway because they believed in Jake's plan and wanted to save their families. Amy said she had been honored to serve under Jake and would do it again without hesitation. Amy's voice broke as she described watching Jake struggle with guilt and trauma after the war. She said the military had failed him by not providing proper mental health care. Society had failed him by forgetting about the veterans who had sacrificed everything. The legal system was failing him now by treating him like a criminal instead of a hero. When Amy finished speaking, the entire courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying. Even the hardened police officers and court staff had tears in their eyes. Everyone realized they were witnessing something special. The greatest hero in human history was finally getting the recognition he deserved. Judge Hill looked out at the packed courtroom and knew that this case had become much bigger than a simple trespassing charge. The whole world was watching now, and she had to make sure that justice was done. She also had to make sure that Jake got the help he needed to rebuild his life and find his way back from the darkness that had consumed him. The courtroom became completely silent after Jake spoke those words. Admiral Jake Morrison. Everyone had heard that name before, even if they could not remember exactly where. Judge Patricia Hill felt her heart skip a beat as she realized what this meant. The man standing in front of her was not just any homeless veteran. He was one of the most famous heroes in human history. Lisa Barnes looked at her client with shock. She had handled his case like it was routine, but now she realized she had been representing someone incredibly important. She quickly flipped through her papers but found no mention of his military rank or service record. The file just listed him as Jake Morrison with no permanent address. Danny Rodriguez felt like he might faint. He had studied military history for years and had read everything he could find about the Galactic War. Admiral Morrison was like a legend to him. The man had saved Earth and all the human colonies from complete destruction. And now he was here in their small courthouse as a homeless defendant. Kevin Wright stood at attention without thinking about it. His military training kicked in when he heard the rank and name. Even though he was no longer in the Marines, he still felt the need to show respect to such a high-ranking officer. Admiral Morrison had been the supreme commander of all human forces during the worst part of the war. Judge Hill needed to know more before she could continue with the case. She asked Jake to tell the court about his military service. She wanted to make sure this was really the same person and not someone pretending to be the famous admiral, but looking at his face, she was already convinced it was really him. Jake stood quietly for a long moment and seemed to be struggling with whether to answer. He had not talked about the war or his service to anyone since he left the military 3 years ago. He tried to forget about those days because the memories were too painful. But he could see that everyone in the courtroom was waiting for him to speak. Finally, Jake began to tell his story in a voice that was quiet but clear. He said he had commanded the human defense fleet during the Galactic War against the Zephyrian Empire. The aliens had attacked human colonies across 3 star systems and were planning to invade Earth itself. Billions of people were in danger, and the human military was losing badly. The Zephyrians had better technology and more ships than the humans. Their weapons could destroy entire planets, and their shields could block most human attacks. They had already conquered 12 human colonies and killed millions of people. Military experts thought Earth would fall within 6 months. Jake explained how he had been given command of the largest fleet humans had ever assembled. Over 800 ships and 50,000 crew members. It was humanity's last chance to stop the alien invasion. If his fleet failed, then Earth and all remaining human colonies would be destroyed or enslaved. He told the court about the Battle of Kepler 442, which had been the turning point of the entire war. The human fleet had found the main Zephyrian force, gathered around a gas giant in the Kepler system. The alien mothership was there along with over 1,000 support vessels. It was the largest space battle in history. Jake's voice became quieter as he described the battle. The humans were outnumbered and outgunned, but they had one advantage. Jake had studied Zephyrian tactics for months and had discovered a weakness in their formation. If he could get close enough to their mothership, he might be able to destroy it and scatter their fleet. But getting close meant sacrificing his own flagship and most of his crew. The plan required someone to fly directly into the enemy formation and detonate the ship's nuclear reactor next to the alien mothership. It was a suicide mission, but it was the only way to save Earth. Judge Hill listened with amazement as Jake described how he had volunteered to pilot the suicide mission himself. He could not ask any of his crew to do something he would not do. But his officers had convinced him that he was too valuable as a commander. Instead, his second-in-command, Amy Foster, had volunteered along with 300 other crew members. Jake's voice broke as he talked about watching his flagship fly into the enemy formation. The crew knew they were going to die, but they did it anyway to save their families and friends back on Earth. The explosion destroyed the Zephyrian mothership and crippled dozens of other alien vessels. The enemy fleet retreated and never returned. The battle had saved Earth and all the human colonies, but Jake had lost 300 of his best people, including many close friends. He blamed himself for their deaths, even though everyone said he was a hero. The guilt ate away at him every day, and he started having nightmares about the battle. After the war ended, Jake received many medals and honors, but none of it meant anything to him. He kept thinking about the families of the crew members who had died, children who would grow up without fathers, wives who would never see their husbands again, all because of decisions he had made. The military wanted Jake to stay and help plan for future threats, but he could not handle it anymore. The pressure and responsibility were too much. He started drinking heavily and could not sleep without medication. His marriage fell apart and his wife left him. He resigned from the military and tried to start a new life as a civilian. But civilian life was harder than Jake expected. He could not relate to people who worried about normal problems like jobs and money. Everything seemed unimportant compared to life and death decisions in space battles. He could not hold down a regular job because the stress triggered his memories of the war. Jake started having panic attacks in crowded places. Loud noises reminded him of explosions and weapons fire. He could not be around groups of people because it made him think about all the crew members he had lost. Slowly, he withdrew from society and stopped trying to connect with other people. Eventually, Jake ran out of money and lost his apartment. He was too proud to ask for help from the military or from his former friends. He thought he should be able to handle his problems alone. He ended up on the streets where he had been living for 8 months, eating from garbage cans and sleeping wherever he could find shelter. The trespassing charge happened because Jake had been drawn to the military memorial. Being near the names of fallen soldiers made him feel less alone. He had been sleeping there for 3 nights before the police found him. He was not trying to cause trouble. He just wanted to be close to other people who had died in service to their country. When Jake finished telling his story, the courtroom was completely quiet. Everyone was trying to process what they had just heard. The greatest hero in human history was standing in front of them as a homeless defendant. The man who had saved billions of lives could not even save himself. Judge Hill wiped tears from her eyes and looked at Jake with a mixture of respect and sadness. She realized that the legal system was about to put a war hero in jail for trying to find a place to sleep. Something was very wrong with a society that let this happen to the people who had sacrificed everything to protect it. Judge Patricia Hill looked at her list and called the next case. Her voice was clear and loud in the quiet courtroom. Jake Morrison for trespassing. Please step forward. Jake slowly stood up from his chair and walked to the front of the courtroom. His lawyer, Lisa Barnes, followed behind him with her papers. Danny Rodriguez heard the name and something clicked in his mind. Jake Morrison. He had read that name somewhere before in his military history books. His heart started beating faster as he tried to remember where he had seen it. The name was connected to something important, but he could not quite place it. Jake stood in front of the judge and kept his eyes on the floor. He did not want to look at her or anyone else in the courtroom. He just wanted this to be over quickly, so he could leave and find somewhere to sleep for the night. The wooden floor was old and scratched, and he could see dust in the corners. Judge Hill read the charges from her paper. Trespassing on restricted property, sleeping in an area marked "No Camping." The incident occurred 3 nights ago at the Military Memorial on 5th Street. She looked up at Jake and saw a man who looked like he had not had a good meal or a shower in months. Danny Rodriguez suddenly remembered where he had seen the name Jake Morrison. It was in a book about the Galactic War, but that could not be the same person. The Jake Morrison from the book was a hero who had saved Earth. This man was just a homeless person who had been caught sleeping in the wrong place. But the name was not common and the age seemed about right. The court clerk reached under his desk and pulled out his phone. He quickly searched for Jake Morrison Galactic War on the internet. What he found made his eyes go wide. Admiral Jake Morrison, hero of the Battle of Kepler 442, commander of the human fleet that defeated the Zephyrian Armada. Age 51. The picture in the article showed a man in a military uniform with medals on his chest. Danny looked from his phone to the homeless man standing in front of the judge. Under the dirty beard and long hair, he could see the same face from the picture, the same strong jaw and the same eyes. But this man looked broken and tired, while the man in the picture looked proud and strong. Lisa Barnes started to speak to the judge about her client. She said that Jake Morrison was a homeless man who had no place to go. He was not dangerous and had not hurt anyone. He was just trying to find a warm place to sleep. She asked the judge to be understanding and give him a light sentence. Danny Rodriguez felt his hands shaking as he looked at his phone again. He was sure now that this was the same man. The hero who had saved billions of people was standing in their courtroom as a defendant. This was the most important person he had ever seen, and nobody knew who he was. The court clerk looked over at bailiff Kevin Wright and tried to get his attention. Kevin was standing by the door and watching the proceedings like he always did. Danny waved his hand and made a quiet gesture for Kevin to come over to his desk. Judge Hill asked Jake if he understood the charges against him. Jake nodded his head, but did not speak. His voice was hoarse from not talking to people very often. Most days he went without speaking to anyone at all. People on the street avoided him and he avoided them. Kevin Wright saw Danny waving and walked over to the clerk's desk. Danny showed him the phone with the article about Admiral Jake Morrison. Kevin read the first few lines and his mouth fell open. He looked at the picture and then at the homeless man standing in front of the judge. Kevin had studied military history when he was in the Marines. He knew about the Galactic War and the heroes who had fought in it. Jake Morrison was a legend among military people. Stories about his tactics were taught in military schools. The Battle of Kepler 442 was considered one of the greatest victories in human history. The bailiff looked more closely at Jake and could see past the dirt and torn clothes. This was definitely the same man from the pictures, the same person who had commanded the largest space battle ever fought. Kevin felt his heart pounding as he realized he was looking at the greatest military hero alive. Danny and Kevin whispered quietly to each other behind the clerk's desk. They both knew they had to tell someone, but they were not sure what to do. This was the middle of a court proceeding, and they could not just interrupt the judge. But they also could not let this continue without someone knowing the truth. Lisa Barnes continued talking about her client. She said he was a veteran who had served his country but had fallen on hard times. She did not know what war he had fought in or what he had done during his service. To her, he was just another homeless client who needed help. Judge Hill listened to the lawyer and looked at Jake with sympathy. She saw many veterans in her courtroom, and it always made her sad. Men and women who had served their country should not end up sleeping on the streets. The system had failed them, and now they were being punished for having nowhere to go. Kevin Wright made a decision. He walked quietly to the side of the judge's bench and waited for a break in the conversation. When Lisa Barnes finished talking, Kevin stepped forward and asked if he could speak to the judge privately for a moment. Judge Hill looked surprised. Bailiffs did not usually interrupt court proceedings unless there was an emergency. She asked if there was a problem that required immediate attention. Kevin said it was very important and related to the current case. The judge told everyone to wait for a moment and leaned down so Kevin could whisper to her. The bailiff told her that the defendant might be Admiral Jake Morrison from the Galactic War. He showed her the article on Danny's phone and pointed out the similarities between the picture and the man standing in front of them. Judge Hill looked at the phone and then at Jake. She had heard of Admiral Morrison like everyone else. The Galactic War had ended only 3 years ago, and the heroes of that war were still famous. But this man looked nothing like the proud admiral from the news reports she remembered. The judge sat back in her chair and thought for a moment. She decided she needed to know the truth before continuing with the case. She looked down at Jake and asked him to state his full name and any military service he might have had. Jake looked up at the judge for the first time. His eyes were tired and sad, but she could see intelligence behind them. Something about his face did look familiar now that she was really looking at him. He seemed reluctant to answer her question and stood quietly for several long seconds. The entire courtroom waited to hear what Jake would say. The question seemed simple, but somehow everyone could sense that something important was happening. Danny Rodriguez held his breath. Kevin Wright stood perfectly still. Even Lisa Barnes looked confused about why the judge was asking about military service in a trespassing case. Jake Morrison finally spoke in a quiet voice that was barely loud enough for everyone to hear. Admiral Jake Morrison, United States Space Command. Retired. Jake Morrison sat in the hard wooden chair and looked down at his dirty hands. His clothes were torn and smelled bad, because he had been sleeping outside for many months. The courtroom was busy with people talking and papers rustling. Police. Officers brought in other people who had broken small laws. Everyone seemed to be in a hurry to get their cases done quickly. Judge Patricia Hill sat behind her big desk and looked through a thick stack of papers. She had been doing this job for 15 years and had seen thousands of cases just like this one. Another homeless person caught sleeping where they should not sleep. Another person who had nowhere to go and no money to pay fines. She sighed quietly and looked at the next case on her list. Lisa Barnes sat next to Jake and shuffled through her papers without much interest. She was a public defender who handled cases for people who could not afford their own lawyer. She had 30 cases that day, and Jake was just another number on her list. She had read his file quickly in the hallway before coming into the courtroom. Trespassing. Sleeping in a restricted area near the old military memorial downtown. Nothing unusual about it. The courtroom was old and had brown wood everywhere. The walls were painted a boring beige color and fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. About 30 people sat in the wooden benches behind Jake. Most of them were waiting for their own cases to be called. A few were family members of other defendants. Everyone looked tired and wanted to go home. Court clerk Danny Rodriguez sat at a small desk next to the judge. He was 26 years old and had been working at the courthouse for 3 years. He liked to study military history in his free time and knew a lot about the wars that humans had fought in space. He read books about famous battles and brave soldiers who had saved Earth from alien attacks. Bailiff Kevin Wright stood near the door in his uniform. He was 42 years old and had served in the Space Marines for 8 years before becoming a bailiff. He had fought in 2 small battles against alien pirates, but had never seen the big war that everyone talked about. His job now was to keep order in the courtroom and make sure nobody caused trouble. Jake tried not to look at anyone in the courtroom. He had learned that it was better to keep his head down and stay quiet. People did not like homeless men, and they often said mean things, or tried to hurt him. He had been living on the streets for 8 months now, and every day was a struggle to find food and a safe place to sleep. His beard was long and gray, and his hair was dirty. His jacket had holes in it, and his shoes were falling apart. He looked like every other homeless person that came through the courthouse. Nobody could see that he had once been something very different. Nobody could imagine that the man sitting in the defendant chair had once commanded hundreds of spaceships and thousands of soldiers. The charges against Jake were simple. 3 nights ago, he had been sleeping near the military memorial in downtown. The memorial was a large stone wall with the names of soldiers who had died in the Galactic War. The area around it was marked with signs that said no camping or sleeping was allowed. A police officer had found Jake there at 2 in the morning and arrested him. Judge Hill finally looked up from her papers and called the first case. It was a man who had been caught stealing food from a grocery store. His case took 5 minutes. The judge gave him a small fine and community service. Next was a woman who had been driving without a license. Her case took 3 minutes. The judge took away her car for 30 days. Jake watched the other cases and waited for his turn. He knew what would happen. The judge would ask him a few questions. His lawyer would say he was sorry and that it would not happen again. The judge would give him a fine he could not pay or community service he could not do because he had no address. Then they would probably put him in jail for a few days. It happened the same way every time. Lisa Barnes looked at Jake and whispered that his case would be called soon. She asked him if he had any questions about what would happen. Jake shook his head and said nothing. He had been through this before in other cities. The legal system did not care about homeless people. They just wanted to move the cases along quickly and get everyone out of the courtroom. Danny Rodriguez looked at his computer screen and saw the next case coming up. Jake Morrison. Trespassing. Age 51. No permanent address. The name seemed familiar to him, but he could not remember where he had heard it before. He had a good memory for names, especially when they were connected to military history. Kevin Wright looked around the courtroom and checked that everything was secure. He noticed that Jake looked very thin and tired. The bailiff had seen many homeless veterans come through the courthouse. It always made him sad because he knew that some of them had probably been good soldiers who just could not handle civilian life after the war. Judge Hill called another case and then another. The morning was moving along normally. She was thinking about lunch and hoping to finish the morning docket before 12 o'clock. She had been doing this job long enough that most cases seemed routine to her. A homeless trespassing case was one of the most common things she saw. Jake closed his eyes and tried not to think about where he would sleep that night. The weather was getting colder, and winter was coming. He needed to find a better place to stay warm, or he might not survive, until spring. He had already lost too much weight and his body was weak from not eating enough food. The courtroom continued its busy routine. Papers rustled. People whispered. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Nobody in that room knew they were about to witness something that would change everything. Nobody knew that the quiet, homeless man waiting for his case to be called had once saved billions of human lives across the galaxy. The greatest hero in human history sat in a defendant chair, and nobody recognized him.